Okay, YouTube might be able to see you right now, but there's going to be like, right now I'm looking at a bar. So those of you who are on YouTube joining us, we will begin in just a moment. Oh, good. Yep, I see us. And okay, and we are ready to begin. So we are we are live now, and we have some delightful dogs joining us today.
I'm going to take care of that.
This is a really special live chat that we've been planning for a couple weeks. We are a group of up-and-coming historical fiction writers, and some of us are 2021 debuts, some of us are from the HF Chit Chat, and we have just lots of historical fiction writers in various stages of the publishing process. And so we thought we'd all come together and share our historical fiction writing experiences, hopefully to just celebrate our love for the genre and also maybe share some wisdom for those of you out there who are also interested in writing historical fiction. So to start off, we'll introduce ourselves, and starting with Jana. Welcome.
Yes. Hello, everyone. Thanks, Carly, for inviting me to take part. My name is Jana G. Noel, and I'm a Canadian-based writer of historical fiction.
Welcome. And Jana also hosts the HF Chit Chat on Twitter, hashtag
Yes.
HF Chit Chat.
Co-host, yes.
Yeah, yes. And you guys have like weekly, is it weekly or monthly chit chats, like Twitter
monthly
events?
We have monthly Twitter chats. We alternate between doing live chats and week-long chats every month.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for doing that. That's a great way to get the genre out there to more audiences. And Erica George, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Erica George. I'm a writer of young adult fiction, and my debut is called Words Composed of Sea and Sky, and it comes out in May of 2021.
Yay, looking forward to it. So excited. And Tirza, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Tirza Price. I have written a YA Pride and Prejudice retelling. It's a murder mystery retelling set in Regency, London, and that will be out next March.
Awesome. Really looking forward to that. And everyone loves the Pride and Prejudice. And Carolyn, introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Carolyn Tara O'Neill. I also write young adult historical fiction, and my first novel is coming out next year called Daughters of a Dead Empire. It's an Anastasia retelling that's set during the Russian Revolution.
Awesome. And those of you who've come to my channel before have seen Carolyn in our previous historical fiction event, and definitely check that out because Carolyn has a great presentation on researching and writing historical fiction. Kate Albus, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Kate. I'm joining you from Maryland, and thank you so much, Carly, for hosting us. My debut middle grade historical fiction comes out next, I think, February. It's called A Place to Hang the Moon, and it is set in World War II England.
Very cool. And Claire, introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Claire Andrews. I wrote Daughter of Sparta, coming from Jimmy Patterson Books, May 11th, 2021. It's a historical fantasy, but I definitely use a lot of my research from historical fiction and Greek archaeology for it. Can't wait for you to read it.
Yay! And Sydney, introduce yourself.
Hi, Sydney Young here. I am an attorney who loves writing historical fiction about great changes in society. So currently I'm writing a story about 60s.
Oh, cool.
And it's a great clash about the environment, civil rights, women's movements, all tied up in a story about a woman that's not talked about much. So
awesome. Thank you. And Gabriella, introduce yourself.
Hey, my name is Gabriella Saab. I am from Mobile, Alabama. And I'm the final third of the HF Chit Chat along with Jana and Sydney. I'm a recent addition to that, so I'm thrilled to be a part of that with them and thrilled to be here talking with y'all about historical fiction. And I'm about to go on submission with my historical, which is also set during the Second World War, about a girl who's been imprisoned at Auschwitz and kind of uses her chess skills to survive. So hopefully it'll come to shelves someday. We'll see.
Awesome. Oh, you're so excited to hear about people going on submission. If you ever want to vent about about the submission process, feel free to
please,
slip
y'all
into my
give me
DM.
all your tips, please.
Yeah, I mean, you're supposed to write something else, and I did that, but it is very nerve-wracking. And the best thing you can do is just vent with other people who have been there, and that's why my DMs are open if you ever want to be like, this is terrible, I'm waiting, when will I hear something?
Seriously.
They said
that's
they
all
were
we do in this industry, right? All we do is wait.
Exactly. If you aren't patient, if you aren't a patient person, the publishing industry is not the industry for you.
That's so true.
Or you'll learn how to be patient.
That's right.
At some point in the process. So we all obviously love historical fiction, and this is why we write this genre. But why is historical fiction important, especially right now? Anyone want to take a stab at that question? Why is historical fiction important?
I think that we always have a curiosity about people who came before us and seeing how they overcame challenges in the past and what we can learn from them. And also reading historical fiction kind of gives us a hope in our own challenging times that there is a future, because those people went through their times and we are the result of that. So I think that it's both, we can both learn from them and we can take comfort from them.
Definitely. And it's also interesting that we tend to have this idea that history progresses forward and upward and to a better world. But the more you learn about history, the more you realize that history doesn't really, it's not linear in that we go from a place of oppression to liberation. History very much repeats itself. And there are moments in history where people experience more freedoms than they have today, and also less, and so it's not like, oh, before we were so backwards and we did these horrible things to people, and now it's all better. History teaches us that it's not that way, that a lot of what happened in the past and what's happening right now, there's mirrors and there's similarities. Anyone else want to take a stab at why is historical fiction important to understand, to write?
I think it's important because it gives us also context for what's happening today. You know, like when we look around us at the events that are going on, we can always trace threads back to things that have happened.
Yes, definitely.
One of the reasons why I got into historical fiction as a kid, it was like my first genre love, was because I was curious about the past, but also in fiction, you get to see the past through the perspective of people who aren't necessarily given a lot of space in history books and in history classes. So, there's a lot of really great historical fiction that I loved as a kid that, now we can kind of look back and say like, oh, that wasn't completely, sensitive to, racial inequalities and all sorts of stuff like that. But like, I connected to it because it was about, a girl, and I'm a girl. So I was like, that's really cool. This is how they lived. But I think it's really important, especially now when you start thinking about, queer people, people of color, all sorts of people who just don't get that space in official records to see them and their stories in historical fiction. That's essential.
A lot of our understanding of history comes from the lens of the oppressors. And I think now is a really important time to give voices to people who've been previously underrepresented in, and you just look at the works that have been published in the past, and they tend to be works that have been published by white, cis men, abled people. And I think that's why it's really important to boost voices of people who aren't that, and that's usually going to get a more nuanced and accurate representation of what the past was like, and also helps to dispel that myth that we are moving forward in a progressively linear manner, and instead that we do have a lot of work to do and continue to do, and we may not even be in a place where we're more liberated than the past. Anyone else care to jump in? I know Carolyn writes also.
I do think though.
Yes. Oh, Cindy, jump in.
Yeah, I think that it really helps us give a hope for the future, because we see people who respond to struggles in one story, and we can see that things have changed for them, and can hope that they can change for us and for those that we care about. And I really think that right now is a golden time in historical fiction, with all the things that are being published by women, by people of color, by indie presses. So it's a great time.
Definitely. I think Carolyn has a lot of really great things to say, because your time period that you write is this really interesting time period. And our understanding of it is a little bit different than maybe what has actually happened. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I really wanted to actually build off of what you were saying, Carly. I think that when we look at history, we so often, like you said, it's written by the oppressors. So often what we're studying is just a single narrative or a couple of dominant narratives that we come to understand as history. And the beautiful thing, what I love about historical fiction, is that the fiction part allows you to really dig into an individual story, right? So it allows you to look at, okay, so we're studying history, we're studying all of these great trends and events that are happening. We're studying about all these like quote unquote important people who lived at the time. What was the impact of all of these things happening on an individual person's life? And you can be, I think as writers, we can be very intentional in who we're choosing to tell this story about, right? So my novel, Daughters of a Dead Empire, is an Anastasia retelling, but it's a dual POV, and the second protagonist is a peasant girl who is a communist herself. And so essentially what that allowed me to do, which was a lot of fun, was to look at the story of what life would have looked like at the time for somebody who really should have benefited most from this revolution that was happening in Russia, toppling the monarchy, and really digging into what did it actually look like for this one person and her family on the ground, and then sort of play around with the details of her life and the detail of how events impacted her and Anastasia together in that story.
Cool. I'm really looking forward to that one. So any last comments on why is historical fiction important? I will move on to, let's talk about how can we make historical fiction relevant to modern audiences? Oh, go for it. Go for it.
I was going to just dive in because my book is historical fiction. It's anachronistic. It's super anachronistic. Like I decided to write a murder mystery retelling of Pride and Prejudice, which sounds kind of bonkers, but I thought that it would be fun. And that was literally like, this will be fun. I'm just going to dive in and see what happens. And so I would hope that that sort of hook, and yes, it is not 100% historically accurate throughout. I take a lot of liberties, but what that allowed me to do was really bring out some of the really interesting historically accurate facts of the time period, and to talk about social justice and feminism, I think in a, kind of fun murder mystery kind of way. So I guess, that was kind of how I made it relevant, which was taking something that people might seem, it might seem silly, but making it fun, and then kind of sneaking in that history in there as well. That's not, a perfect approach for everybody, but that's what I did.
Can I build off of that?
Yes.
I think that's a great answer. And I think that in terms of making it relevant, a lot of times I think that people don't know exactly what historical fiction is, and there's a perception that it's only biographical fiction. It's only 100% factually correct as far as history can be factually correct. And I think that, you know, in blending genres like that, like murder mystery and history, and I think that mixing genres like that is a way to make it more relevant, because people often need sort of like an invitation to read historical fiction, and by tying it to another genre that they might be more familiar with, it makes it something more familiar to them, and more, you know, it seems like it might be fun instead of like school. And it's just it's a way to introduce people to it.
Yeah, and there's also so many stories that haven't been told in like stories of characters' lives, for instance, of queer people and disabled people and other marginalized people. We don't have a historical fiction that centers those people. We do, but we need more of it, basically. And so, I mean, that's why I write queer characters in historical fiction, because those are stories that we haven't really we don't have much of. We have so many, you know, heterosexual standard historical fiction type stories, and so we haven't seen that queer perspective for a little while, for a while. And how can we? And so I think that's exciting. Like whenever you see like a marginalized character in a setting that's not what you're used to seeing, I think it's really exciting. Anyone else want to jump in? How can we make historical fiction relevant to modern audiences?
I was going to say that I think so much of the relevance comes from the relevance of historical writing comes from the universality of the things that people, characters have dealt with, whether it's now or whether it was 100 years ago or whether it was 500 years ago. That sibling rivalry, I mean, I write for kids, so sibling rivalry, the importance of home, things like that, and that those universal truths to me are what makes something relevant, whether no matter who you're writing about or no matter what time period you're writing about. Yeah, definitely. And from oh, good. I'm glad, Gabriella, you're jumping in.
I'm just enjoying listening, but kind of building off of that, I agree. It's so easy to hear historical or look at historical and think stuffy textbook people who are just one note, no fun, boring people you'd read about at school. But it's just so important to kind of use use historical to show that humanity has, you know, dealt with the same things and struggled with the same things and experienced the same emotional journeys and things all throughout time and place, regardless of who they are and where they come from. And so we as writers have that opportunity to use historical fiction to show that and show the modern reader that these people weren't all that different from us. They're just a different time, different place, but still we're united through those struggles that endure time, place, and everything else.
Definitely. I agree with that. Yeah.
Oh no, Sydney.
I think that also storytelling, you have a chance to be, can you not hear me? Can you not hear me?
Cut out briefly, but now you're back.
You're good. You're good.
So I think that we as a society are so voyeuristic. And so as historical fiction writers, if we can dig deeper, if we can show people more into past lives and show them things they didn't know, that's going to satisfy that historical relevance issue.
Definitely. And can I also talk about the aesthetics? Because let's face it, that's why I really like historical fiction as well. The aesthetics.
It's the only reason we do it.
The clothes.
The costumes.
The architecture.
The weapon.
Yes.
The carriages, the horses. But what you were saying, actually what Gabriella was saying and Sydney was saying too, I'm reading a historical fiction book right now that's a time period that I wouldn't normally be interested in, but I love the author. And what's gripping me about it is the characters. And like when you connect with the characters, you're like regardless if they're on a spaceship or in the 1800s or in a fantasy setting, like if you connect with the characters, you're like, oh, I love this book so much. And you can, and with the aesthetics too. That's a nice cherry on top.
That's right.
And can I add one thing about that as well, which is that, historical fiction is such a like many genres, is such a wonderful lens for looking at different aspects of our current, present day society, right? So, the concerns the issues that we as writers are driven to write about in history are influenced by our society currently, are influenced by our lives currently. For me, that was income inequality and class warfare. I mean, those are the things that I got to build out in my book, and that's something I never shut up about in my daily life. So historical fiction also is relevant because it allows us to critique and compare with present day society and where we are today.
Yeah, I'm going to add to what Carolyn's saying. With my book, it's actually dual point of views, one a contemporary girl living on Cape Cod and another a girl in 1862. It was really important for me to flesh out the parallels that both of them were experiencing, because kind of like what happens to one in modern day is also happening to the same girl almost, a century and a half before. And I think that it was difficult because sometimes the circumstances are just a little bit difficult. Sometimes the circumstances are just that the rules of the 1862 society isn't the same, obviously, as present day. And yet similar things can happen, especially to girls in this time period. So,
yeah.
And that's true whether you're looking at 100 years ago, 150 years ago, or like Claire, your book is what, 2000 years ago?
Well, I was going to say that it's also relevant because even today, what we're learning like in the news is that, and like as we're all seeing across social media, is that a lot of what we're taught in high school or secondary school, depending on where you're from, is romanticized. And it's not true. Like all that we've learned about Christopher Columbus is not true. And I think like historical fiction gives us a better avenue to kind of teach people what actually happened in a lot of ways while also making it fun to read. So
yeah, definitely.
It's good to like give people a sharp dose of reality while also being like, here's a fun adventure to go along with it. Because like as Carolyn said, it is like thousands of years ago, but like the image that people have of say Sparta is so romanticized. People idealize this place and it's disgusting. And like, that's kind of like what I'm going for is like, in the first book, you don't really see that, but it's like, you really don't want to romanticize this place. Just like you really don't want to romanticize, say, some countries like 500 years ago.
Yeah, definitely. And Claire, your book features like a female warrior. And I think your book like helps to show that like women weren't the way that we maybe think they were. Like there's more complexity in women's lives in your time period than.
I wanted to like give a voice to, I feel like myths are also really important to understanding a lot of countries' histories that weren't written down, because that's how the histories were passed along, is through mythology in a lot of ways. And like, I really wanted to give a voice to these Greek women, because my book takes place in ancient Greece, that like you never really heard anything about except by the words of a lot of men that are passing along stories of them being damsels or helpless or just useless. But if you look back on Greek history, these women were often just confined to their houses for their entire lives. And I wanted to give them their own stories that we never heard before.
Definitely. And this is a nice segue into our next question, what drew you to the specific historical time period that you all are writing? Who wants to jump in?
I guess since I'm already rambling.
Go for it, ramble.
My undergraduate degree was in history and archaeology, and I've always loved Greek mythology. And like, it was really nice to see like how these myths were actually brought to life through the Greek daily lives, and this is how they interpreted their lives and the things that were happening. So like these wars between the varying kingdoms, they're actually just kind of like symbolized through the mythology and stuff like that. So it was interesting.
Cool. Very cool. Yeah, no, I love Greek stuff, and Yeah.
Someone else want to take over?
I'll say I'm
Yes.
almost a little bit reluctant to say where my specific interest came from, because I'm afraid I'm going to lose all of my children's literature street cred by confessing this. But my interest in the time period that I wrote about came from reading The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, which I loved. But I'm a little ashamed to say that the part that fascinated me the most was the evacuation, the fact that children were being evacuated from London to the safety of the countryside. And that stayed with me. Like, since I was a child, that's stayed with me.
Yeah.
So here you have like one of the most beloved children's fantasy novels of all time, and the part that stayed with me the most was the part that was actually true and that was actually historical fact.
That's so funny.
My novel is specifically about the evacuation of London in the Second World War. So
very cool, very interesting, and just
C.S. Lewis.
Yes, and I think many people are inspired by that. I don't think you lose your street cred for being inspired by that book at all. Who wants to go next? What inspired you from your time period? Go for it, Sydney.
Okay, so I think really honestly the last 4 years has helped me decide that I want to look at the 60s. And, I guess I was idealistic and thought we had done so much in the 60s, and I was a child of feminism 80s and didn't think we'd be back here. But luckily, I keep talking about politics. My book's not that much about politics. It's just in that time period, so it's a look at the lives of some women who were really on the forefront of a lot that happened, but more look at their personal lives. So.
Awesome. Yeah, it's interesting. The 60s for you, did you find that the 60s was a time of like going forward, and then maybe in the 80s that was a time of maybe going a little bit backwards as far as progress?
I'm solidly in the 60s right now. So it's just interesting because everything that happens, there's always a forward and back. There is always a forward and back. And my heroine, one thing, and it is biographical fiction, but one thing that she always says is it's a step in the right direction, which I like. I like the hope that we can try to do things to forward mankind, womankind, everything, and do better and take steps in the right direction. So.
Yeah.
And then of course all the 60s stuff, the fashion, the Motown,
the hair,
the music, the dancing.
Moon.
Yes, all of that.
Just great stuff.
Definitely. And I'm inviting those of you who are watching on the channel. I'm going to try and keep the channel chat open. I see that there's been some comments, and I love to see those comments. I'm going to try to moderate and respond to them as well. But if anyone who's watching has a question for our panelists, feel free to post it in the chat. We'd love to address your question. And I'm going to move on to our next question, which I think will be a little bit fun. What's the weirdest, most interesting thing that you've discovered while researching?
Ooh.
Can I go first?
Go for it, Jana.
Go for it.
Okay, yeah. So I didn't mention at the beginning. My book is set in the early 13th century, medieval England, and one of the things that I discovered researching has to do with divorce, which was illegal during that time period. The church did not allow for couples to get divorced, but there were a few instances in which couples could separate. And one of those instances was if the man was impotent, the couple could separate, because the whole purpose of marrying was to procreate. So if you can't procreate, there's no reason to be married. But if you went to the church and said and made it and claimed that the man was impotent, they wouldn't just take your word for it. And so there was a famous case where there was a man who made this claim. And so they brought in what they called 7 honest women. These women were actually prostitutes. And they brought in the 7 honest women to try to verify whether or not this man actually was impotent or not. And it's even more funny because the man's name happened to be John. and they brought in these prostitutes.
Oh my gosh.
Yes. So
did he get aroused or
no,
not?
he didn't. And he was scolded by one of the prostitutes and made to feel like less of a man. And it's very amusing.
See, it makes me wonder what if he was asexual?
Well, that's what I thought, right? He might have been gay
or not attracted to women.
Then he would have then I guess he would have gotten his divorce.
Yeah, that's true, but they make him feel like less of a man. It's like you are anyway, so much value is placed on the
anyway,
that's like that scene in History of the World. Have you guys seen that one, the Mel Brooks film?
It's been a while. What's the scene?
Like that scene where they're like trying to prove the guy is a eunuch and they get out the prostitutes.
Oh my goodness.
That's funny. Maybe that's where they got that from, that case.
Well, I'll jump in. I don't have. Oh, there's a comment.
We have a good question. I do want to get back to this because I think we have lots of good things to share, but we have a question from the audience and I do want to get to these. So this is especially for Carolyn. How do you deal with aspects of history that have been very Hollywoodized and the myths are larger than the truth?
That's a great question.
Wrestling with the Anastasia legend. That is definitely, I think lots of people love the animated movie in my generation anyway. And of course that story has been told over and over and over again. From my perspective, it depends on the author, right? Sort of how you want to tackle that. For me, I really wanted to sort of disregard a lot of the Hollywood stories, the made up, imagined things, a lot of the things that we accept about Anastasia's story. And really, for me, it started with the facts and it started with the history itself and what we know about her family's murder. And in real life, of course, Anastasia was killed. There's no question anymore about that. But for me, I guess I can say I was inspired by all of those legends, but I really was. So what drew me to this story was the real life history and just reading about the real life history of the Russian Revolution and the Romanovs and the story of the Romanovs. So I sort of I didn't even think about it. It wasn't even an effort. I was just, the history itself is so fascinating and so rich that just playing with that really gave me more material than I could use in like 20 books. So yeah.
As writers, I feel like we're constantly fighting against people's perception of what history was like versus what like the actual history was like. And there's a term for this, which is the Tiffany effect. Have you heard of the Tiffany effect?
I've heard of it.
Okay. Jana, maybe you can explain.
Yes, because it's another medieval thing. So there is the perception that the name Tiffany is a modern name, but it's actually, Tiffany is like a kind of a pet name of the name Theophania, which was a very common name in the medieval period. But because it's not something that a lot of people know, they just believe that that Tiffany is a modern name. And so if they saw it in a medieval book, they would think that it's an anachronism, but it's not.
Yeah. If you're submitting your medieval manuscript and you have the main character named Tiffany, people will roll their eyes and be like, "Oh, obviously this person doesn't know authentic medieval life." And I fight with this too because I find there's phrases and words that were used back in my time period, but they seem incorrect. So I tend to try to find another word that seems more old-timey, in favor of maybe the one that was commonly used but has a modern feel to it.
I think that we also get that same effect just in terms of some of the types of characters we choose to write about. Like if you write about queer characters or characters of color, there's often the belief that, oh, there were no gay people back then, there were no people of color back then, and that's another thing that we're fighting against.
Yep, I feel that. As my book has a lot of queer characters in it, and just as a diverse characters in general, people are like, would that person be there? Yes. They've always been there. I want to go back to our weird things that you found in historical research, because we just touched on that, and I think there's a lot more. Anyone else find any weird things in historical research, weird or interesting?
Not really weird, but it's a funny story, so I'll tell it. So I went to Poland to research my book. My story set in Poland. And so in Auschwitz, I actually had the opportunity to visit a group of religious sisters called the Franciscan Sisters of the Family of Mary. And I just kind of happened upon, I knew I wanted to visit just from research, but I happened upon the archivist, which was awesome. So, so the convent in Warsaw is situated right where the ghetto used to be. And so it was easy for them to smuggle children out, supply them with false certificates to claim they were Catholic, and they would put these Jewish children in these orphanages and schools run by the sisters. So that was kind of what they did throughout the war. So there was a priest who helped these sisters who was of Jewish descent, who had converted to Catholicism and become a priest. But obviously because he was Jewish and because he was a priest, the Nazis started to look for him, to find him and arrest him and everything. So his looks gave him away, but the sisters were like, all right, we have to hide him. So they dressed him up in a habit to hide his hair and hide his arms, everything else. And he just marched past a bunch of soldiers on the street, and they took him out to one of their safe houses outside of the city, and he got to hide there for the rest of the war.
That's awesome. I love it.
It was a cool story. Yeah.
That's awesome.
I have a fun story.
Yes, go for it.
Okay, so one of my characters is traveling with Lady Bird Johnson, and she runs out of money, and Lady Bird has to give her some money. So she asks her how to make it out, and I guess they start talking about checking accounts at this point. And Lady Bird finds out that this character has a joint account with her husband. And Lady Bird says, "Oh, honey, I wouldn't trust the angel Gabriel with a joint account."
Oh my goodness.
That's
I like it. One funny thing, so my book is set in Norway. Well, it's a fictional country inspired by Norway in the early 20th century. And one thing I found was, in the wintertime, hay doesn't grow, grass doesn't grow. And so the Norwegians need something to feed their horses. And so if they run out of hay, something that they do is chop up all the fish heads from the fish and boil the fish heads, and then feed the boiled fish heads to their horses.
Oh, wow. That's pretty good for horses.
And apparently the horses really like it.
Fish soup. That sounds great.
That's interesting.
Yep. Norwegian horses eat fish soup. Any other cool, interesting stories?
Mine's not as good as Jana's, but I did a lot of research into like crime, court proceedings, all of that, because in my retelling of Pride and Prejudice, Lizzie Bennet wants to become a solicitor, and she has to solve a murder case in order to kind of prove her worth. And I was stunned and delighted to discover that almost all of the proceedings from London's Central Criminal Court are available to read for free online. And it was really cool. And so at the time, it was, there was not a lot of transparency right away about court proceedings, and you could go in and watch, but you had to pay an admission fee. But what they would do is they would publish these proceedings for people to read about, and oftentimes people would embellish them and make them sound much more, dramatic than they really were. But it's really cool. You can just go online and you can just read, and you can even sort through all of the various crimes and the outcomes. And I spent so much time just reading old cases.
Oh, cool.
And it's all there. So yeah, it was pretty cool.
Are there like transcripts of what the lawyers were saying?
Yeah.
Cool,
I mean, in the time periods that I was focusing on, because I think it goes from 1674 to 1913. You can read almost any case. And I was focusing on the early 1800s. They weren't really defense lawyers. It was like this witness and that witness, and here's what the magistrate says. And yeah, but it was really interesting because I got to kind of get a feel for like how things were presented in a courtroom, and all the various witnesses that they brought in. So yeah, it was really cool. I spent so much time on that, and there's always like that one point when you're like, okay, I have to stop researching and I have to actually start writing, and that was like my point where I was like, I need to stop reading these cases.
Yeah, but that's cool that you get the language that they used and like the phrasing. Like that's always like a delightful, like, oh, whenever you come across like a cool phrase, you're like, ooh, I'm gonna write that down and steal that.
Yeah, a lot of my details and the sort of twists and turns came directly from those transcripts, which is really fun.
That's awesome.
Cool. Hey, since research tends to be the main thing that trips people up in the historical fiction writing process, do any of you have any tips for research? How do you approach research?
I feel like if it's possible, if like I heard Gabriella saying that she went to Poland to research, I mean, that's amazing. Go to the place that you're trying to research and take tours and go to museums and just kind of like try to immerse yourself in that time period, because sometimes sitting on the computer and reading on a screen, it doesn't really have the same effect. Like I know with me, my story takes place on Cape Cod, and I spend my summers on Cape Cod anyway, but I took the time to go to a lighthouse and hear about the history of how lighthouses were run when they weren't automatic. I went through a whaling captain's house and I heard all about what it was like to be this captain on the sea for years at a time, hunting whales. And it really made like a difference, like to just kind of immerse yourself in that surrounding.
Yeah, definitely. I can imagine. That's awesome. Any other tips for research?
Reviews are your friend. I mean, like normally, like as an author, I think that we're told to, steer clear of especially our reviews. But when I'm like looking up books that I might potentially use for research, I found that the reviews are pretty spot on, and historical information is actually niche enough that the reviews are actually very helpful. So like someone will say, this one's really dry. And I know that I'm going to have a really hard time using that book for research. But when I'm told that a book is readable, that'll help. And a lot of the times the reviews will be like, actually, what this author says is incorrect based on this text, this text, and this text. And I found that Goodreads reviews are actually pretty good. And especially on Amazon, I found them really helpful. Cool. And also, I feel like Google is not always your friend, because lots of times where people argue with me, well, I Googled this, so it must be true. And I'm like, yeah, my degree says you're wrong.
I must give a shout out to Google Books, because on Google Books, you can search by the time period that the thing was published. And I like to do this for metaphors and similes, because I want to use metaphors that are like historically accurate. Like, of course, I would want, like in real life, I would say, oh, he's as tall as a skyscraper. But obviously in historical times, they didn't have skyscrapers. So I'm like, okay, I need to describe how tall he is. What is it, like a historical? So I will go on Google Books, 1800 to 1903 and search, he's as tall as, in little quotes, and then I get all these metaphors that I can see.
That's so cool.
That's a good one.
Tuck that one away.
Do you remember any of the metaphors, like the similes that you
there's some I stole. Drunk as was one that I was really struggling with. He says drunk as, I'm like, and I found drunk as a boiled owl. I have no idea what a boiled owl is, but it was used a couple times in my research.
Is that something they feed to the horses as well? Boiled owls?
Yeah.
Maybe it's some sort of, dish or something that I should have to do more research on what a boiled owl actually is.
Yeah.
But that's when I stole. Yeah.
Right.
Mhm.
We're all going to be Googling that when we
I
hang
know.
out.
Yeah.
So curious.
What is a boiled owl?
We have been talking for 45 minutes and it's been delightful. So this is a good time to wrap things up. So to wrap things up, I'd love to hear, what are you reading, or what are some historical fiction books that you love?
I have a whole stack with me. I was like, my books. I have like some of my favorites. Obviously, because I'm a Greek mythology buff, I really like Margaret George's Helen of Troy retelling because she pulls from a lot of historical research to tell it. And June Hur's Silence of the Bones. Have you guys read that yet?
Not yet.
That is
no.
amazing.
It's just so good.
So good.
Silence of Bones. I love it. I can't recommend it enough. And right now I'm reading Fable by Adrienne Young, and it's really good. So
Mhm. I recently read The Water Dancer by Ta-Nehisi Coates, and I really like that. It's set in the antebellum South, and it brings magic realism into that time period. And I thought it was a really engaging and beautiful read.
Awesome. Good to check that out for sure.
I'm reading Sue Monk Kidd's The Book of Longings about Jesus's wife. So it's amazing. When I first heard about it, I was like, oh Lord, can we go there? But man, she evokes the time, and it's talking all about what happens to these women, and it's amazing.
Well, I'll recommend somebody.
Go for it.
Oh, sure. One author that I just love all her historical fiction is Ariel Lawhon. She's written I Was Anastasia, most recently Codename Helene. So mostly like 20th century settings, but they're just so well researched, and I just so admire what she does with timeline. Like, talk about intricacy. Like, she is just constantly moving from place to place and telling stories in a non-linear way and multiple narrators, and it's just like a masterclass in historical fiction. So definitely pick up her works. They're amazing.
Very cool.
One of my favorites is, it's historical, but there's light fantasy in it, is Enchante by Gita Trelease. That is such a good book. Oh my goodness. Bless you.
French Revolution, yeah?
Yeah, yes.
Very cool. I'm going to check it out. I'm reading Taylor Jenkins Reid's Daisy Jones and the Six, which is a time period that I would normally not even care about. And it's about a rock band in the 70s. And I'm like, that is so not my genre. But I picked it up because I love Taylor Jenkins Reid so much. I loved her Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo. If you have not read Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, pick it up. It's amazing. And it's about Hollywood glamour in the 1950s, 60s. And I'm not gonna give it away, but definitely read and find out what happens. But what I love about Daisy Jones and the Six is, again, time period I don't care about, but the characters I care deeply about. And it's a really unconventional format, which makes it really good. And I'd also recommend Madeline Miller. I'm sure everyone is reading Madeline.
Yes, everyone loves Madeline.
But if you haven't read Madeline Miller, you have to, because again, that's another author who is brilliant at characters, and you like fall in love with the characters and can't help but like keep on reading the book until you find out what happens. And she is so good at evoking the time period too.
Isabella Allende is also really good at historical fiction. Like House of the Spirits is one of my favorite books, and it does such an amazing job painting like a country that I haven't actually read much about. So
definitely.
I would read pretty much, I mean, historical fiction or not. I'm a huge fan of Mary Doria Russell. I love her historical fiction and her non-historical fiction. I've loved Kate Atkinson's historical fiction. A God in Ruins was one of my all-time favorites. And most recently, Colson Whitehead, The Nickel Boys. Which is one of those. Was just, I mean, Gabriella, you were saying a master class. That was exactly what I thought about that book, that it was a master class in writing, not even just in historical fiction, but in writing. It was brilliant.
Any last recs?
So three of my favorite YA historical writers are Jennifer Donnelly, Ruta Sepetys, and Stacey Lee. I think all of their historical books are just excellent. I've read them all and I love them. One of the things that I do to kind of like help with research, but also to just kind of like get my brain in the right, space to write in my time period is read fun books that are set in the time period. So right now I'm reading To Have and to Hoax by Martha Waters, which is a very fun romance novel set in Regency time period. And it's always fun to just kind of see how other authors handle, similar time periods and how they incorporate the historical details. So that's what I'm reading and I'm loving it.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much. Oh, one more? What?
Not one.
Yes.
Some recent reads.
Yes.
So Justina Ireland, Dread Nation.
Yes, thank you for mentioning. Yes, thank you.
Amazing. Historical, like fantasy, sci-fi. I don't know what you would call zombies, but Civil War, American Civil War and zombies.
Yeah.
I'm currently reading the sequel, which is awesome. Also, one of my friends, J. Albert Mann, wrote a book called The Degenerates. She was on the last panel with us. And it's set during the eugenics movement. It's young adult, set during the eugenics movement at an institution for what we would consider today folks with disabilities. Very powerful novel, also young adult, historical fiction. And then I just wanted to put a plug out for Jacob Have I Loved, which is just, for me, a really influential piece of historical fiction published 30 years ago, maybe. But yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much for mentioning Justina Ireland and J. Albert Mann's. Yeah, because their works are awesome. I feel like whenever one of these panels ends, I'm like, oh, I should have mentioned that person. but so thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining me today. I really do want to have more of these historical fiction panels because there are so many of us, and I feel like we often get forgotten as a genre, but I think we're awesome, and I want to boost everyone a bit more. So definitely, if you're watching, follow HF Chit Chat on Twitter, hashtag HF Chit Chat, and also a hashtag the 2020 Wonders on Twitter, because we are all sharing our work on there for upcoming 2021 debuts. And like I said, we'll have more of these historical fiction chats coming up. And so if you're a historical fiction writer, slip into my DMs and join us on our next thing. Okay, thank you guys so much, and bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.